The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the modest suburban street where Lisa lived with her 3 children. The golden light softened the chipped paint on the front porch, and the overgrown bushes framing the small house. Inside, however, everything felt heavy, as though the world had turned its back on them. Lisa sat at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of unpaid bills. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned over an envelope, its contents a stark reminder of her situation. It had been 3 months since the accident, 3 months since the phone call that shattered her world. Her husband, Mark, had been everything to her. He was her partner, her confidant, and the glue that held their family together. Now, that glue was gone, and everything felt as though it was falling apart. In the living room, Emma, her 8-year-old, was trying to entertain her younger siblings. She set up a makeshift tea party with plastic cups and stuffed animals, doing her best to mask the tension that hung in the air. Ben, just 5, sat quietly beside her, his eyes occasionally darting toward the kitchen where their mother sat. Lily, barely 3, clung to Emma's arm, her thumb in her mouth. Lisa wiped her eyes quickly, not wanting the kids to see her cry again. She forced herself to her feet and began making dinner, pasta again. It was cheap and filling, though the kids had started noticing the lack of variety. As she stirred the pot, her mind raced. She had cobbled together a few part-time jobs, cleaning houses during the day and stocking shelves at night, but it wasn't enough. The bills piled up faster than she could pay them. Worse, she felt like a ghost in her own home, with no time to give her children the love and attention they needed. The sound of a knock on the door jolted her from her thoughts. She frowned. It was rare for anyone to visit, especially this late. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the door. Mrs. Carter stood on the porch, her silver hair glowing softly in the dusk. She held a casserole dish covered in foil, and her kind eyes met Lisa's with a warmth that almost melted the wall Lisa had built around herself. "I thought you and the kids might like a home-cooked meal," Mrs. Carter said gently. Lisa hesitated, her pride wrestling with her gratitude. "You didn't have to." "I know," Mrs. Carter interrupted, stepping forward to place the dish in Lisa's hands. "But I wanted to." For a moment, Lisa stood frozen, the weight of the casserole dish oddly comforting in her hands. She opened her mouth to say something but couldn't find the words. Instead, she nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered finally. Mrs. Carter smiled, her weathered face softening. "You're not alone, Lisa. Remember that." As the older woman walked away, Lisa closed the door and carried the dish into the kitchen. When she uncovered it, the aroma of baked lasagna filled the room. For the first time in what felt like forever, a small smile tugged at her lips. That night, as the children ate with more enthusiasm than she'd seen in weeks, Lisa sat quietly, watching them. Her heart ached with a mix of sorrow and hope. For the first time since Mark's death, the weight on her shoulders felt just a little lighter. But in the back of her mind, a question lingered: could she really accept help? The answer would come soon enough. The morning sun crept into the kitchen, illuminating the now empty casserole dish from Mrs. Carter's visit. Lisa stood at the sink, washing it and reflecting on the quiet generosity of her neighbor. She felt both grateful and uneasy. Accepting help wasn't easy for her. She'd always prided herself on being self-reliant. A soft knock at the door broke her thoughts. Drying her hands, Lisa opened it to find another neighbor, Mr. Garcia, standing there with a toolbox in one hand and a warm smile. "Good morning, Lisa. I noticed your porch light's been flickering. Thought I'd take a look," he said. Lisa blinked, taken aback. "Oh, you don't have to." "Nonsense," Mr. Garcia interrupted, stepping inside before she could refuse. "It'll only take a minute." As he worked, Lisa's children peeked out from behind the couch, curiosity getting the better of them. Emma ventured closer, asking questions about his tools. Soon, Ben and Lily joined her, giggling as Mr. Garcia made exaggerated faces while twisting wires. When the light finally shone steady and bright, the kids cheered. Mr. Garcia chuckled and waved goodbye, leaving Lisa with a functioning light, and a heart that felt just a little fuller. A week later, Lisa noticed something unusual as she returned home from work. Her driveway was lined with cars, and the faint sound of voices came from her backyard. Anxiety bubbled in her chest. What was going on? She stepped inside cautiously, only to be greeted by Mrs. Carter and a group of neighbors gathered in the living room. The children were playing with a pile of toys she didn't recognize. A table was set up in the corner, stacked with bags of clothes and other essentials. What is all this?" Lisa stammered. Mrs. Carter stepped forward, her hands clasped warmly. "We've been talking, Lisa. We see how hard you're working, and we want to help. These are donations from the neighborhood, clothes for the kids, toys, and even some groceries." Lisa's eyes darted around the room, her chest tightening. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Mrs. Carter said, her voice gentle. "Just let us help." Tears welled in Lisa's eyes as she looked at the items that had been gathered. A little voice inside her still protested, whispering that she didn't deserve this, that she should be able to manage on her own. But another part of her, the part that saw her children's smiling faces as they played, began to let go of that pride. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The room erupted into smiles and reassurances, and for the first time in months, Lisa felt the warmth of a community rallying around her. The following week, Lisa found herself sitting in a small office, nervously clutching her resume. Across the desk was Mr. Thompson, a kind-faced man who owned a local hardware store. "I heard about your situation from Mrs. Carter," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I could use someone reliable to handle inventory and customer service. It's not glamorous, but it's steady work, and the hours are flexible enough for a single mom." Lisa's breath caught in her throat. A stable job with flexible hours? It sounded too good to be true. I don't know if I'm qualified," she said hesitantly. Mr. Thompson smiled. "Lisa, I've heard how hard you've been working to keep your family afloat. That kind of determination is worth more than any resume." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time, they were tears of relief. "Thank you. I won't let you down. You've got this," he replied warmly. As Lisa left the office, job offer in hand, she felt a surge of hope she hadn't felt in months. When she got home and told her children, they hugged her tightly, their giggles filling the small house. That evening, as Lisa tucked them into bed, she sat for a moment at the edge of Emma's bed, stroking her daughter's hair. For the first time, Lisa didn't feel like the weight of the world was solely on her shoulders. She had people who believed in her, who were willing to help her find her footing again. And maybe, just maybe, she could start believing in herself too. The following week, Lisa returned home after her first day at the hardware store, tired but proud. As she approached her front door, she saw several of her neighbors gathered on the porch, chatting with each other. Mrs. Carter waved her over with a smile. "Come on in, Lisa. We were just talking." Lisa hesitated for a moment, but then walked over, her heart warming as she saw the familiar faces of the people who had been so kind to her. "Hi, Mrs. Carter," Lisa said with a smile. "What's going on?" "Well," Mrs. Carter began, "we've been thinking about how tough it must be for you to balance work and the kids. And we want to help make things a little easier for you." Lisa's stomach churned with a familiar feeling of discomfort, but she held her tongue. "What we've decided," Mrs. Carter continued, "is to take turns watching the kids while you work. That way, you don't have to worry about finding a sitter, and the kids will get to spend time with their neighbors." Lisa blinked in surprise. "You really want to do that?" The neighbors nodded in unison, each offering warm smiles. "We'll work out a schedule. I can take Mondays, and Mia can take Tuesdays. She loves playing with Emma." Mrs. Carter gestured to a teenager standing beside her, who gave Lisa a shy wave. "And others will rotate through the rest of the week." Lisa felt the tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She didn't know how to respond. Her pride wanted to protest, to say no, but the relief of knowing the kids would be safe, loved, and cared for while she worked made the weight of the offer hard to resist. "Thank you," Lisa whispered, unable to say more. As the neighbors began to disperse, Lisa watched them walk away, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude she couldn't fully express. She had never known kindness like this, and it made her heart swell. That night, after tucking the kids into bed, Lisa sat in the living room, staring at the empty chair where Mark used to sit. She missed him so much, but she also realized she didn't have to carry this burden alone anymore. The community had reached out, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe they genuinely cared. The following afternoon, Lisa stood at her kitchen counter, packing lunch for the kids, her mind spinning with worry. Her shift at the store had gone well, but she couldn't shake the guilt that crept in whenever she thought about the neighbors' help. Mrs. Carter had been babysitting Emma, Ben, and Lily that morning. Lisa had been able to focus on work without constantly checking her phone, but now that she was home, she felt a deep unease. She'd been taught all her life that asking for help was a sign of weakness. She'd always prided herself on doing things on her own, and now, even though she was surrounded by people offering assistance, she felt embarrassed and small. As she packed the last of the sandwiches, she felt a familiar weight in her chest. She sat down at the kitchen table, holding her head in her hands. It was then that the doorbell rang. When Lisa opened the door, she found Mrs. Carter standing there, her warm smile softening the edges of Lisa's discomfort. "I thought I'd come by and check on you," Mrs. Carter said gently. "How are you doing?" Lisa hesitated, then sighed. I'm struggling with all this. It feels wrong, you know? I don't want to burden anyone, but I can't keep doing everything on my own." Mrs. Carter stepped inside, sitting beside Lisa at the table. "Lisa, I've been there. After my husband passed, I felt the same way. I didn't want to lean on anyone, but sometimes, letting people help you isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength. You're teaching your children a valuable lesson: how to give and receive love, how to care for each other." Tears welled in Lisa's eyes. She'd never seen it that way. "You're right," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "I've been so scared of admitting I need help." Mrs. Carter smiled softly. "You don't have to do it alone, Lisa. We're all here for you." Lisa wiped her eyes, taking in Mrs. Carter's words. She still felt vulnerable, but maybe it wasn't so bad to be open to others. Maybe asking for help was actually a way to build something stronger than independence: community. A month passed, and Lisa began to settle into a routine. The job at the hardware store was more than just a paycheck. It gave her a sense of purpose and pride. She was finally able to start breathing a little easier, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was holding things together. At home, the kids flourished under the care of their neighbors. Mia, the teenager, had become Emma's close friend, and Ben and Lily were constantly talking about the adventures they'd had with Mrs. Carter. The house, once filled with tension and the weight of Lisa's worries, now echoed with laughter and joy. One evening, after work, Lisa sat down on the couch, exhausted but happy. She watched her children play in the living room, and a sense of peace washed over her. She could hear Mrs. Carter and Mr. Garcia chatting outside as they watered the garden. For the first time since Mark's death, Lisa allowed herself to believe that things could be okay. She had a job, her children were thriving, and most importantly, she had a community behind her. As she leaned back into the couch, she whispered to herself, "I'm not alone." The morning began like any other. Lisa rushed through her chores, packing lunches, and trying to get her children dressed for the day. But just as she was about to leave for work, Lily, her youngest, started coughing in the kitchen. Lisa's heart sank as she knelt beside her daughter, who was looking up at her with feverish eyes. "Mommy, I feel cold," Lily whispered weakly, her small body trembling. Lisa's stomach dropped. She'd known Lily had been a little under the weather the past few days, but she hadn't realized it was this bad. "I'll stay with you, honey," Lisa said, scooping Lily into her arms. She quickly sent a text to her boss, letting him know she couldn't make it in today. As Lisa sat by Lily's side, she felt helpless. She didn't have sick days, and she couldn't afford to miss work. Her mind raced with worries, about her job, about bills, about the constant pressure of trying to keep everything afloat. At that moment, the doorbell rang. Lisa stood up, cradling Lily in her arms, and answered. It was Mrs. Carter, standing with a bag of groceries in hand and a look of concern in her eyes. Is everything okay? Mrs. Carter asked, her voice full of kindness. Lily's really sick. I don't know what to do, Lisa admitted, her voice breaking. Without missing a beat, Mrs. Carter walked in, her eyes scanning the room. Don't worry, Lisa. I'll watch Lily while you go to work. You need to keep things going. I'll take care of her, and if it gets worse, we'll call the doctor. Lisa's eyes welled with tears. I don't know how to thank you, Mrs. Carter. You don't need to, Mrs. Carter said gently. Just go, and know that she's in good hands. Lisa hesitated for a moment, but then kissed Lily's forehead. I'll be back soon, baby. You'll be okay with Mrs. Carter. As she stepped out of the house, her mind was still a whirl of worries. But knowing Lily was in safe hands eased the weight on her shoulders, even just a little. That afternoon, the community didn't just offer sympathy, they offered action. Several neighbors checked in on Lisa, bringing food, medicine, and reassurance. By the time she returned home from her shift, Lily was resting comfortably on the couch, surrounded by blankets, with Mrs. Carter at her side. I think she's going to be okay, Mrs. Carter said, patting Lily's hand gently. Lisa sank into a chair beside them, overwhelmed with relief. Thank you. I don't know what I would have done without you. The community had come together when she needed it most, and for the first time in months, Lisa didn't feel like she was facing her challenges alone. 2 weeks later, after Lily had fully recovered, Lisa found herself standing in the yard, surrounded by neighbors, a feeling of warmth and unity filling her heart. Mrs. Carter had organized a small gathering to celebrate the family's recovery, and the community's role in helping Lisa through the hardest days of her life. There was laughter and music, children running through the yard, and neighbors chatting over plates of food. Lisa watched the scene unfold, taking it all in. How much had changed in such a short time. Emma and Ben were playing with their friends, their faces bright with joy. Lily, too, was giggling as she chased a butterfly in the garden. Lisa stood quietly for a moment, grateful for the sense of normalcy she hadn't known in so long. Mrs. Carter approached, her arms open for a hug. You've come so far, Lisa, Mrs. Carter said, wrapping her in a warm embrace. Lisa returned the hug, her voice thick with emotion. I don't think I could have made it without all of you. We're a community, Lisa, Mrs. Carter said with a smile. And that's what we do for each other. Later, as the sun began to set, Lisa stood before the group and took a deep breath, feeling a lump in her throat. She hadn't planned on speaking, but the moment felt right. I just want to say thank you, Lisa began, her voice wavering slightly. When Mark passed, I didn't know how I was going to make it. But each of you reached out when I needed help. You gave me a job when I didn't know how to support my family. You cared for my kids when I couldn't be there. You have all become my family. She paused, wiping her eyes. I've learned that asking for help isn't weakness. It's the strength to accept love and support when it's needed most. I hope I can do the same for someone else one day. The crowd stood silent for a moment, and then Mrs. Carter raised her glass. To community. Everyone joined in, raising their glasses. To community, they echoed, their voices strong and united. Lisa smiled, the warmth of the moment filling her heart. She realized that the love she had always tried to give her children had now been returned to her tenfold, and it had come from the community she never expected to need but had come to rely on. As the party wound down, Lisa found herself outside, sitting on the steps of her porch. The evening air was cool, and the stars began to twinkle overhead. She watched as her children played with their friends, their laughter echoing through the yard. Mrs. Carter joined her on the steps, her presence comforting. You've come a long way, Lisa, Mrs. Carter said softly, glancing out at the kids. You've made a home for them here. And you've shown them what it means to be part of something bigger than just your family. Lisa nodded, feeling the weight of the past months lifting from her shoulders. She had struggled, yes, but she had survived, and more importantly, she had found hope again. You're right, Lisa said, her voice steady. I didn't think I could do it without Mark. But I'm starting to see that I don't have to do it alone. The two women sat in silence, watching the children run around the yard, the glow of the street lamp casting long shadows on the ground. Lisa's heart swelled with gratitude as she looked out at the people who had made all the difference. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about building something lasting, something that would carry her family into the future. She looked up at the stars, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. We've got this, she whispered, her voice filled with quiet confidence. And for the first time in a long time, she truly believed it.